Thank you very much. I'm positive that that is the most dramatic entrance that I will ever make in my entire life. You know, when you teach 18-year-olds for an American national government class, they see you and they kind of go, oh, here we go, you know. Yeah, Dr. Moore, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming out today. You know, it's been a while since I've been down here, far too long, in fact, and I was driving down with my colleagues, and it's such a beautiful day out, and my car just seemed to know exactly where to go. It's just wonderful to be back at the Clinton School. There's really something special about this place, and really thank you for all for being here, and we hope we have a wonderful panel here for you today, and like Dean Rutherford said, we're going to talk a lot about attitudes about women. We're going to focus a lot about women in work and then women in political life. And one of the interesting things that I have is I have a great team of people that I get to work with. And so I'm going to do my best to introduce them, but not nearly as well as Dean Rutherford did. The first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Angie Maxwell. Angie got her PhD from the University of Texas, but we've forgiven her for that. She studies American studies. She's uniquely qualified to talk a lot about the things we're doing today because she took her comps, which every time I think about this just scares me to death, but she took her comprehensive exams in Southern literature, Southern history, and Southern politics, and somehow she did all of them. Her current work is focusing on the South and then how the South often is very defensive, even with an insecurity type reaction when the national media come down. And she's got an advanced contract and actually signed the real contract from the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Press. The next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Pearl Ford Dow. And Dr. Dow is a member of the Blair Center team and then also a member of the African American Studies program at the University of Arkansas. I have the distinct pleasure of being able to say that one of the best things I did when I was the chair of the political science department is hire Pearl. After I did that, I said I can't do anything better than this, and so I stepped down there. Pearl is currently working on research that focuses on linked fate, and that's specifically a concept that scholars in African American studies use to say that what African Americans feel happens to me happens to the whole group. And so uniquely often they act in a cohesive group. And a lot of the research that we're going to be talking about in this here has reference to that too. The last person I would like to introduce is Dr. Rafael Jimeno. And I should point out, and I forgot, that both Angie and Rafael are the Diane D. Blair Endowed Professors. Angie's title is the Diane D. Blair Assistant Professor of Southern Studies, and Rafael's is the Diane D. Blair Assistant Professor in Latino Studies. And he works in the Political Science Department and in Latino Studies. And he's currently working, a lot of his interests are on Latinos that are native born in the United States versus Latinos that come here later, foreign born. And he has some fascinating research that shows that there's a lot of socialization differences that are between those groups. He's also working with Pearl on how African Americans are viewing Latinos and how Latinos are viewing African Americans. And that is very important, particularly if you are a student of Southern politics, because really the future of Southern politics is how and if these two groups coalesce in a voting bloc or not. So with those introductions, I'm going to move over to my place, and then I'm going to introduce really our talk and our survey. Let me make sure this one's on. Okay, great. As Skip mentioned, I just would like to say a little bit more about the Blair Center. You know, the center that we represent is named after Diane Blair. And for those of you that may have known her, she was the model that we all really try to live up to in terms of being a professor, being an activist, being an amazing teacher, as also an amazing scholar. We're always happy to be able to say that we're with the Diane Blair Center. But this year is really special because we're able to say that we're partnering with the Clinton School on so many things. And one of the things that's the biggest thing we're partnering with is this survey. And I'm going to move here to just a little bit about our survey methodology. And the survey that we did here is very, very unique. I don't know of any other one like it in the country, and I've been conducting academic surveys for 20 years. We're going to tell you a little bit more why, but we're able to accurately talk about attitudes about the South among very different groups with a degree of accuracy that really no one else has. We get calls from people at Duke. Most recently, got an email from folks at Duke that would love to have our data. We're happy to be able to say no. We're able to, not till my colleagues are done with it, then you can have it. But it is very unique, and it's something that is really setting the Clinton School and the Blair Center apart. One of the things, besides Year of the Woman, I should point out too that Dr. Charlotte Williams is a partner in all this as well, and she was added tremendously to this, and we've got a lot of questions on the survey about community philanthropy and trying to help us understand more of what Charlotte's always talking about: time, treasure, and talent. I almost had 3 T's. So we'll hopefully, she and I will be able to come back soon and give a report about community philanthropy. Okay, next one. So most national surveys have 1,000 people included, and sometimes if you're watching the media surveys, they'll have 500 people, and then their margins of error are very large. The national surveys that I generally publish off of, the NES at the University of Michigan or the General Social Survey at the University of Chicago, will have 1,200 to 1,300 people in there. And that is fantastic unless I want to talk about African Americans, or if I want to talk about Latinos, or if I even want to talk about women in the South. Because if you have 1,200 people in your sample, if you disaggregate that down to the South, now you're maybe down to 400, 500 people if I'm lucky. And then if I say how many women are in there, well, maybe there are 200 women. And if I say how many African Americans or Latinos, maybe I'm down to 20 or 30. So it's really almost impossible to talk about attitudes about anything in the South or with Latinos and African Americans except with our survey. And that's the really unique part that we really want to drive home. We have representative samples of all of these groups. We can talk about each of these groups with a margin of error of plus or minus 2.4, every one of these groups. So we like to say that it's really 6 surveys in one.
Okay, so the survey company that we utilized is called Knowledge Networks, and it's a GfK company. Knowledge Networks was actually co-founded by a Stanford political scientist, Norman H. Nye. For those of you who are familiar with statistical analysis software, Nye also created SPSS. And Knowledge Networks has quickly become the go-to firm, or the gold standard, as it were, for academic survey research, including the well-established American National Election Studies at the University of Michigan that Todd already mentioned. So in spite of the very well-known credentials of Knowledge Networks in the academic world, because internet surveys have been previously stigmatized, it's really important, we think, to state that we're not talking about the traditional images of non-scientific online surveys that you may be aware of, pop-up windows as you navigate an unrelated site. We are talking about huge sampling frame that Knowledge Networks has been able to amass that bridges the digital divide. What this means is that they provide computers and internet services to randomly selected people who don't already have this access. And so this allows them to reach traditionally underrepresented groups, not just younger people, but also people who live in rural areas like Arkansas, and even Spanish-speaking respondents. So it's really amazing. And their sampling procedure is, of course, randomized. They used address-based sampling, and this is key in avoiding a biased sample. And just in case there are any further doubts, it's also blinded. So the respondents who participate don't know who the survey sponsors are. They're unaware of the Blair Center or the Clinton School or who's funding it. And the other benefit of doing an internet survey is actually that we are able to ask many more questions than we would be able to ask if we were doing a survey over the phone. So it really is a very strong methodology that is followed to collect this data.
Okay, so what did we ask? Well, the poll has so much on it. We're going to focus today on a couple of questions, and we'll tell you at the conclusion about some other reports that are forthcoming. But since we were doing this Year of the Woman, in 2013, we decided to put on the poll something called the Modern Sexism Scale, which is a series of questions that have been tested and developed by scholars to try to tease out kind of prevailing sexist attitudes. So, for example, people won't say anymore, or most people won't say anymore, a woman is not equal to a man, or a woman should make less than a man publicly. But they will say some other things that get at this kind of gender consciousness and this prejudice that underlies a lot of current attitudes. And this is another reason, by the way, that we wanted to use knowledge networks and an online sampling. Research has shown that when you're asking sensitive questions like that, if you're talking to an interviewer, like on a telephone poll, you're much less likely to say kind of maybe what you feel. But with the anonymity that comes with an internet survey, we get very accurate sampling. So for example, the CDC is now exclusively using this company that we used because they can't get people to tell accurate information about their health and so on. So it's why if you're going to be asking about sexism and you're going to be asking about racism, this is a huge advantage. Not to mention, of course, that we can reach people in the South that we usually don't get. So what's in this modern sexism scale? 5 questions that we use that all focus on pretty much women in the workplace. They're scaled on a 5-point scale, with 1 being you strongly disagree to 5 being you strongly disagree. So by the end you have kind of a joint score, on the scale. So the questions you'll see are up on the slide. Many women are actually seeking special favors, such as hiring policies that favor them over men under the guise of asking for equality. Or skipping down, feminists are seeking for women to have more power than men. Discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States. So when you're getting someone who is considered kind of highly sexist, they're going to agree or strongly agree on all of these questions. And I guess what's really underneath the questions is just an attitude that there is some kind of distrust in feminism, that it's a zero-sum game, that one group's going to lose power if women gain power, that there's complaining, that it's not real. And that's the kind of modern sexism we see today. And so that's what we wanted to ask and see how prevalent that is within our country and within the South.
So when we created this, the scale of these 5 questions, the scores range from 5 to 25. The overall average of the score was 14, and the standard deviation is 3.49. And so what that means is that what we're looking at is we know that we have an average of 14. But we're trying to find out about the percentage of persons that may actually fall above or below that average. And so with the standard deviation being 3.49, persons that scored 18 or higher, those are persons that we identified as having above average responses and being above average sexist responses. And so what we wanted to do was that we saw that looking at people with negative views of women, we identified those respondents who scored 1 standard deviation above the mean. So everyone with the 18 or above, as I said, is considered a high respondent. So look at a percentage of men, as you can see on this chart. We see that men who report above average views, you see that 25.7% of white men had above average responses, in comparison to 22% of Latinos and 19% of African American men. Overall, at least 20% of men in each of these groups reported attitudes that were 1 standard deviation higher than the mean. In the next slide, we can also see that when we look at gender and region, there are some differences there as well. When we compare the green and the black bars, where we're comparing non-South and South, we see that there's a greater percentage of men in the South who report sexist attitudes. There were about 25.5% of Southern men who had above average scores on the scale in comparison to 23.8% of non-Southern men. We also see something interesting with the women as well. We see among Southern women, there were just under 17% that reported above average sexist views in comparison to 12.5% in the non-South. So overall, we see that the South contained the greatest percentage of persons with above average sexist response. And so this is consistent with looking at both Southern men and Southern women. So when we look at to see if there are any differences across age, and most people assume that when we're talking about sexism, that it is a generational variable. But we see that age is not a significant determinant when we look at sexist attitudes. Across all age categories, at least 23% of the male respondents report sexist attitudes. So for those who might be hoping that sexist attitudes might change through generational replacement, unfortunately, we can say that may not be the case, given that we see these percentages reported among men that were young, from ages 18 to 29, as well as the men that were over 60. So overall, we find that there are a substantial percentage of men and Southern women who report above average levels of modern sexism. While there were more Southern respondents who express negative attitudes, the percentages of persons across all age groups is very concerning.
You know, before we change to the next slide, I just wanted to say that we checked these numbers over and over and over because, in all honesty, when I first saw this, I was like, oh my God, it's got to be wrong. You know, please tell me that it's wrong, because it kind of flew in the face of what I was thinking was happening. And yes, as Angie's telling me here, I think this is something that we're seeing as women are entering the workplace, and these modern sexism questions are measuring that. You're seeing this kind of hostility across all age groups. And we did have to cut some slides, but we looked across different education groups too. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of hope there as well. Particularly as soon as men are entering the workplace, they're increasingly seeing very hostile type environments between men and women there. Okay, before we really start switching gears to away from the workplace and into politics, we're going to start talking in a minute about future. I'd like to look back just a couple months here, and if you recall, political scientists love to look at the gender gap and why do women seem to overwhelmingly favor Democratic candidates. And this is something that happened in the late 80s, and people were talking about it might be a recurring trend. In the 90s, it became a staple, and so even journalists talk about the gender gap now, and it's something that we hear about in paper all the time. And if you can see these two quotes up here, in the 2012 presidential election, the gender gap reached an all-time high. And that's something that we're really interested in. Why? And one of the things that our poll allows us to do, as you've seen, is break these down into ways that other surveys can't. When we broke the gender gap down between the South and the non-South, we found that the gender gap in 2012 was very, very real. I mean, there's about a 24% gap between women in the non-South who supported Obama versus women who supported Romney. But then when you look at the South, the gap was almost non-existent. Okay, admittedly, there's about a 2% gap there, but very surprisingly, the gender gap that we talk about, that national candidates and even local candidates tend to rely upon, not only in turnout but vote choice, it really doesn't happen in the South. And we think that most journalists and we think that political scientists and sociologists have missed this in the past, mostly because they don't really have the data to be able to talk about it.
Okay, now to the politics. In addition to our questions about modern sexism, we asked a battery of questions to determine if respondents felt they would see a female president in their lifetime. Now, what is important to remember here is that we were not asking, do you want a female president? We're asking, do you believe you will see one? And so be mindful of that as we go through these next few slides. So when we look at race and ethnicity, when we look at the respondents who believe they will see a female president in their lifetime, what we can see is possibly that the presence of Barack Obama probably has had a significant impact on the response of African Americans and Latinos. So when we look at African American response, we see that they are the most optimistic in believing that they will see a female president. Over about 83%, 83.2% responded yes. Latinos and Latinas were slightly lower, with 80% expecting to see a female president. Caucasians were the least optimistic, and that is that they were at 75.6%. So these are national numbers here. So now we began to look at gender and region. We see that there are some distinctions here again between groups. As you can see, the highest percentage were among non-Southern blacks and Southern Hispanic women, who both reported a level of optimism at 84%. But then we see Southern white women and Southern white men were the least optimistic, reporting at 74 and 75%. And in some respects, this might be seen as good news, since nearly 75% of all groups expected to see a female president in their lifetime.
Okay, so given that so many people expect to see a female president in their lifetime, we also wanted to see whom respondents favored in hypothetical matchups in the upcoming 2016 election. So we join all the pundits in the media who are already theorizing about 2016 results. We considered a lot of possible candidates, but included only Hillary Clinton as the likely Democrat, based primarily on the fact that she's the only Democrat that is being discussed in terms of the 2016 election at this point in time. And also, given the fact that there's been quite a bit of research done on her rising popularity. I mean, earlier in December of 2012, Gallup released the results of a survey that basically determined that Hillary Clinton was the most admired female politician, and second only to Barack Obama amongst all politicians in the US currently. And we included her in hypothetical matchups against likely GOP contenders, again, as it stands now, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and Chris Christie. But the exciting thing is that these choices also give us quite a bit of variation when it comes to candidate age, sex, and ethnicity. So some interesting comparisons to make there. So on this slide, what we're looking at is just the overall nationwide results for these matchups between Hillary Clinton and the Republican frontrunners. So, I figured there would be a few Hillary supporters in the crowd. So the percentage of respondents indicating they would vote for in each of the three matchups are represented in this figure. Obviously, as you can tell, blue is for Clinton and red is for the various GOP contenders. There is strong nationwide support for Hillary Clinton, above 58% across all matchups. So if these results hold for the next few years, she would be well positioned for a run for the presidency if she chose to take that step. Interestingly, the highest support for a GOP candidate went to Chris Christie, likely reflecting his popularity in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and how much people admired the way he handled himself. And then in the next slide, we actually disaggregate the matchups by sex. So in this figure, the blue bars represent men and the red bars represent women. And in this figure, you can clearly see the gender gap that Todd was making reference to earlier. Hillary Clinton maintains her large proportion of support among women. Hillary has over 60% of support from women regardless of the hypothetical matchup. And then when we look next at men, interestingly, we see that Hillary received less support relative to female respondents, but nevertheless, a majority of male respondents still indicated that they would vote for her over the likely GOP contender, between 53% and 57% of respondents, which we think is rather significant and obviously an indication of how well respected her time at the State Department is in the American public. So again, it all depends on what happens in the next few years, but very encouraging results for any future Hillary supporters in this crowd.
Okay, so now to kind of break it down even further, we know there's strong support for Hillary Clinton right now, but we kind of couldn't resist digging deeper into Clinton-Bush 2016 campaign. Also, strategically, you know, a lot of times this early on, some of the advantage that a candidate has to do with name recognition. So specifically to look at, and a lot of the Republican pairings against Hillary are similar numbers, but to look at Bush specifically is, instructive in this case. So in this figure, we disaggregate the responses by region and race and ethnicity. And Hillary's support is the blue bar, and Jeb Bush's support, the hypothetical race, is represented in the red bar. So I guess the thing that's most interesting to me personally is that Hillary's polling close to even with Bush among Southern whites. I mean, that's a pretty shocking kind of finding that she's pulling that kind of support among Southern whites particularly, which suggests a potentially competitive race in the South if this were to happen. She opens up an enormous gap among Latinos in the South, 20 points, and an explosive gap among Latinos outside of the South. And of course, she's got a large degree of support, we know, from non-Southern whites. But to really see the draw in the South, I mean, we couldn't include every single slide, but she's even pulling Republican women in pretty amazing numbers for a country that's so partisan right now and so divided. It's very promising for female candidates in general. So looking again a little more closely at a hypothetical matchup with Jeb Bush, looking at South and non-South kind of deeper. The key is when you have true representative samples of African Americans and Latinos in the South, you get a much better picture of what the South is going to do. I mean, you guys know that a lot of the kind of conservative push in the South is primarily driven by white respondents, particularly these polls. And sometimes we get polls that seem to suggest that the South is monolithic, and it looks that way sometimes on election day, and it feels that way, I think. But we also know that 40%, just for example, in Arkansas alone, voted for a Democratic candidate in 2012. And so it's not, now there's no representation because none of those races were won, but that's not monolithic, so to speak. It's majority, but it's not, there are cracks, I guess, in that solid South. And this persona of Hillary Clinton really, widens those cracks and could make the South competitive again, at least at the national level. State level, I don't know. So again, greatest amount of support is among non-Southern women, least support among Southern men, but still fairly good numbers. So even among Southern men, 67.8% of Southern men indicate they'd vote for over Jeb Bush. And of course, it's still early, but that's a big gap, which surely would close as, people get to know candidates and so on. But it's in our current polarized partisan, situation, that means she's got to be pulling almost all independents, which is, pretty significant, at least right now. So I guess to kind of conclude what we're saying here today is there's definitely a war on women. I mean, there is definitely sexist attitudes that are persisting among young men, persisting in the South. But there do seem to be some kind of attitude that a female president is maybe inevitable, or many people believe they'll see it in their lifetime, young and old. And also that there are candidates, Hillary Clinton being one example, of a candidate that's kind of been, for lack of a better word, degenderized. She just kind of doesn't function in that space. So she's kind of above that space in some capacity, and those negative attitudes towards women somehow aren't applying, particularly when your most aggressive or most highest percentage of sexist group is in Southern men, but she's pulling those kind of numbers among Southern men. And so those are the candidates, the ones that kind of occupy that space above the stereotypes, kind of like Barack Obama did, that tend to have the ability to break through those kinds of ceilings that have been in place for a long time. I think it's a rare, combination, but it's definitely proof that, it can be done at the national level. So we want to answer a lot of your questions. We also want you to know that we're going to have some future reports coming out on attitudes about immigration in March, unemployment and economic outlook in April, a South versus non-South comparison on a host of policy issues, including climate change and healthcare in May, and then a deep look at African American voting patterns, because we have these large samples, so we can actually pull out by education level, by religion, by all of these different things. It's so nuanced and diverse, and it's not talked about that way. And you really can't understand the South unless you really dig into those subgroups. It's a much more different picture than it used to be. So we're going to be having a big conference, I think it was mentioned next November, that's going to look at the legacy of second wave feminism on politics, the good and the bad, and that'll be in November up in Fayetteville. And so pay attention to our website. It's bccs.uark.edu, so Blair Center, Clinton School. .uark.edu, and we'll keep everything kind of posted there. So thank you.
Great job. Interesting numbers. Great job. More reports to come. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Yes, I figured we'd have a few. Here's some right here.
When was the survey done? I'm curious if it was the questions came before President Clinton spoke at the National Convention and became so, more well thought of, and if it was before or after the whole Benghazi thing.
It's after that. We polled right after the presidential election. I mean, one of the reasons that we chose to survey after the presidential election as opposed to before is there's a lot of research that shows that if you ask people about attitudes toward people or different issue positions during the campaign, that they change their attitudes according to what they've been told on the media or what they've been contacted. And so if gun control has become a big issue during the campaign, then people start thinking about that more. So if you really want to get a good gauge of what people are thinking in terms of issue positions and how they view African Americans, how they view Latinos, how they view women, it's really important to go after the election until everything calms back down, and then you get a really good pulse. So this was fielded about it was done in I think two and a half weeks right after the presidential election.
Yes, question right here.
I personally know there will be a female president in my lifetime, and I haven't got that long to go, so hurry up. But I hate to see all the women rush to just one woman. I know that it's important to get her in, which I think we'll do, but I hate to see us forget about Dianne Feinstein and Condi Rice, because they are unbelievable women, and I don't know whether you all have an opinion about that. Do we need to get Hillary in and then think of them? It's a shame to pass them up.
I would say that you're dead on about this. I mean, we've recently seen coverage about women not being included in leadership positions in Congress, and so we know that female talent in politics is horribly underused. The reason, I think, for all this massive amounts of attention focused on Hillary Clinton is because not only the perceived effectiveness with which she handled her job at state, but also because Clinton is a brand name, as I think Angie mentioned in her presentation. And this is not just nationwide, but for many communities in particular. I mean, for the Latino community, for example, the name Clinton is associated with the 90s and this boom time that moved many members of the community into the middle class. And so there was high amounts of Latino support for Hillary Clinton even in the Democratic primary. I think that's a positive thing, that even if it takes away attention from other able leaders, simply because there's this perception of almost inevitability that her time has come, that she is seasoned enough to hold the highest office. And so, yeah, we need more balance, but it's a good thing.
Well, the other thing I would add to that is that there's going to be a lot more research done by the Blair Center Clinton School partnership between now and 2016. So there will be plenty of time to ask questions. I think the real issue in this question was, will you see a woman president in your lifetime? And there's one out there that is rumored to be a candidate, may be a candidate, could be a candidate, and I'm not announcing her candidacy. But I think it shows that a woman can be elected president, and that was what we were trying to do in this survey. Christine, what's the question right here? We'll get over here.
I guess following up on that, what does that really mean? Because there's two parts to your presentation that, yes, there's inevitability, but how does that, what are the linkages or discrepancies between the daily reality that men's attitudes are based on? So what if there's women president? Is that what, how does that guide your research? What does that mean when we look at these numbers that there's no generational difference between men's attitudes towards women? And I might point out women's attitudes towards women. So how does this big national transcending these stereotypes actually translate to daily reality?
Well, I think, well, one of the future reports is going to be on the economy, and I think what we're going to see is that a lot of this is a sense of competition. So for those of you that followed the recession and the recovery process, you know that women fared pretty well in comparison to men as far as losing jobs and being able to maintain their jobs longer. So we may be seeing a sense of competition with women, particularly with African American men who are used to black women working because they've always worked. And so there's probably something else there that's going on to have these attitudes continue to persist. But I think we may be able to actually aggregate some more of that when we look at those economic numbers.
I also think that inevitability, or thinking it's inevitable, I think that's progress. And I think that's from women on both sides of the aisle that have got into positions of authority. We get used to having people on the vice presidential ticket. We get used to having people running for the nomination. And then it starts to seem like it is inevitable. And even if that doesn't translate into daily life, I think it does trickle down. I do think that. I think those coattails trickle down. I think we have, evidence that shows that. And I think that exactly what, Barack Obama's ability to break that ceiling has done to inspire African American candidates to run and seek office is the same thing that a female candidacy that's successful can do. Is it partially symbolic? Yes, but are those symbols important? They absolutely are, I think, particularly in politics.
I have a question right here. This lady's had her hand up for a long time. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I just real quickly, I just wanted to say, what I wish we had was the modern sexism scale over time. So we could say whether or not these numbers are improving or not. So they may be the same over generations, but they may be lower. I mean, maybe 20 years ago, we would have seen 50% of the people in each of those highly above average categories. So stay tuned, because when we're going to ask these questions again and again and again, and hopefully we'll see, as we see women in leadership positions, we'll see those attitudes changing.
Did your definition of Southern include only native Southerners, or was it broader to include people who live in the South but were raised elsewhere?
It's a great question. For today, it includes people who currently live in the 11 states of the former Confederacy. That's our definition. That definition is very debatable, and we know that. But this time around, we did ask, how long have you lived in the South, and if you've lived in the South in the past. So as we dig deeper into the data we got about a month ago, we will be able to distinguish between the South as a mindset and an identity and holding those attitudes, and just geographic location, which of course we all know is part of the story, the changing demographics in the South and that Southern identity element. Now, political scientists don't really love to talk about identity, because in the end, it's which state you live in that affects the outcome of the election. But I love to talk about identity more than anything else, and think it's completely politically relevant. And we do know from our survey in 2010 that people who claimed a Southern identity, there were some major differences between people who claim it and people who live just in those geographic borders. But for all intents and purposes, the borders are what shape that electoral map, so they still matter both ways. So we should be able to dig deep.
Representative Tyler.
Thank you. Just one comment on the question, on the statement about the women who fared better during this recession. I think some of that was because we had non-traditional industries that fared better, but also because they were also lower paid, and when people decided who they were going to lay off, they'd lay off the higher paid. That wasn't what I was going to say. I guess my question has to do with, we see the data on Southern men and women and their attitudes. Will we continue to see underlying information in terms of the values that's shaping that opinion, and will we be able to draw any policy conclusions from that in terms of education and employment and economic development that should go along with that to change these opinions?
this survey is huge, and as my colleague Angie mentioned, we got this data about a month ago, and so what we're reporting today is just some descriptive statistics on various measures. What we're going to do in the coming months is look at those relationships between different variables like level of education, time of residency in the South, and the modern sexism scale or support for various candidates, and we'll be able to actually see the relative impact of one variable versus another on all of these dynamics. So yes, absolutely.
And I also just want to jump in there and say, and we don't have this slide up, but a lot of this is, particularly the modern sexism attitudes, and this is just what people self-report in the poll. People self-report. That it does affect party ID. We've got about 15% of self-identified Democratic men who fall into that sexist category, and we've got about 36% of Republican men. And so that does affect policy outcome. And those attitudes are tied to views on abortion, they're tied to views on health care, they're tied to views on all of those things. And so part of it is, whether people run on it or not, is understanding those components and being able to really break them apart and see which issues are impacting which groups, particularly men, that are holding a lot of this, majority in these state legislatures and in the U.S. House.
Ms. Abrams, you have a question right up here.
I was listening carefully to the slides that you presented, but I probably need to look at the research deeper. It didn't mention, or I didn't see, where the variables of faith as it relates to the South. It doesn't deal with imagery. We know that in America, when you deal with politics, if you go back and look at presidents who have been elected in the history of this country, you look at the women in the Senate and the House, Mr. America and Miss America is very important. And as we move into the digital arena, that's going to have a greater impact. Like that's why everybody's getting facelifts and everything else to be Miss America. How did you all deal with that as some variables that's impacting the questions, the 5 questions that you have?
Go ahead.
Well, we do have questions, which we will get to because we just got this data pretty recently, where we do ask about religious affiliation. And this time we asked people not only about their church attendance, but also they were able to tell us what denomination they're affiliated with. So we will be able to get to that. But you're absolutely right as far as the perception of what is the role of a woman in a leadership position versus that of a male. And that goes back to my earlier comment, particularly with the African American community, where Black women have a very distinctive role in the community that is very different and distinctive than how white women are in their community, as far as women in volunteer position and even having a sense of more of autonomy in their homes. And so hopefully we can get to some of that when we begin to look at religion and look at even income and look at educational levels to see where these women actually are in these communities.
When you said something about religion and leaders, it reminded me, and my colleague Angie was reminding me too, that we asked in the last survey that we did, what religion do you believe Barack Obama is? And you've seen some media reports about that, and Pearl and Angie and I have published a couple of articles on what is going on with that phenomenon. We asked that again in this survey, but we also went and asked people whether they thought Romney was a Christian. Now, my colleagues may have some data on that. I haven't looked at that yet, but one of the things that we definitely want to do is try to ferret out, like, who thinks that these people are the religion that they profess, and who are these people that think, no, I don't care what they're saying, there's something different. I don't have an answer to that right now, but it's something that we're looking forward to publishing on that soon.
The reason why I asked that question, I know the research is showing more and more people don't even identify with faith. I'm talking about the major faith. They don't even go to church.
Okay, let's, all right.
Well,
In the
it's a
very
very-
back, in the very back, Evie's got a question back there on the very back. I know there's a lot of questions. We just got to wait. Please, everybody be patient. We're trying to get to everybody.
I don't know if this is accurate, but I've heard before that immediately following an election, there can be a polling bias where people are more likely to say they supported the winner because they want to be on that bandwagon. I'm curious if that played out at all in this poll. And also, would that affect at all support for Hillary Clinton? Would people think they're more likely to support the Democrat because everyone selected the Democrat in this election?
That's definitely possible. You know, if we have a choice, if we ask beforehand, we ask before the election, then we are biased in the sense of whatever issues are being really pronounced in the campaign, then we don't really gauge that very well. If we go after the election, you're most definitely right that there is a tendency of people to say, well, I voted for the winner, because you don't necessarily want to say, I voted for the guy who lost, right? We think, though, that in this situation, the internet survey allows people a little bit more anonymity. So even with questions about sexism and racism, we're thinking people are more likely to be able to say, I feel free to say I voted for the person who lost, and not feel embarrassed as they might when they're talking to somebody on the phone. But even if there is still this bias, which honestly we're not sure if there is, we don't think that there would be differences in gaps, right? So even when we see a gap between the North and the South, and we see a gap between men and women, unless there's some theoretical reason why one group or one region would be more likely to say, I don't want to say I voted for the loser, or more likely to say I wanted to vote for the winner, we think that those gaps are real.
Joe, you have a question back there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. I'm really interested in what you're doing. And a couple of weeks ago, when the Women's Foundation update of the 1973 Commission on the Status of Women's report was released to the public here, there was a wonderful passage in that report, which I believe was taken from your research, on how men and women responded to the capacity of political figures, male and female, to speak about international issues and other, what kind of authority ordinary men and women gave them.
I think that came from Lynette, from Janine Perry's Arkansas poll. I think that's where that information came.
Because I was very interested in that data up against the kind of modern sexism that you're reporting, and wondered how you would put together those two sets of information. The strong support for female political figures up against this kind of distressingly even and consistent modern sexism.
I guess I'll jump in. The only thing I wanted to really speak to was that this happens a lot of times in survey and academic research. You'll have one group of researchers in some university or institute that conducts this amazingly interesting survey on various topics, and then a completely different survey that includes slightly different questions. So you always think, oh, what if this group had asked that question, or what if that group had asked this question? And sadly, as interesting as it might be to kind of compare across, we can't do that because the two surveys use completely different methodologies. So we can't actually address a direct comparison with the Arkansas poll because it's a completely different animal in that regard.
Senator Pryor.
This may be an Arkansas time,
But we do, because we got so I got to do it.
Okay, thank you, Skip. I've got to ask this question because Jimmy Lou Fisher is here. Yeah, you're still here, Jimmy Lou. Does any of your data support the idea that Arkansas is ready for bringing it close to home, or could elect a woman as governor?
You know, when it comes to Arkansas, let me just talk about my opinion. Because the reality is that our sample, we really are trying to get at these groups, and so we sampled regionally and nationally. So there aren't really enough. I mean, the scholar in me wants to say, yeah, I know I'm being a good politician as well as a good scholar here. We have maybe, you know, less than 100 people from the state of Arkansas in this survey because we're really trying to talk about the whole South and the whole region. So I don't really have data from that here. You know, In terms of the state of Arkansas, I think that, this is my personal opinion, I think we're going to be dragging our feet. You know, maybe my colleagues will disagree with me here. I'd like to say differently, but even if you look at some of the things that the state legislature is doing even recently, it doesn't seem to me to bode that well that we're on track for, you know, a female governor anytime soon.
But one thing that is instructive about these numbers on Hillary Clinton, even though they're national numbers and we're talking about the presidency, is this, as I said before, this kind of space that she's occupying, this view that she's such a strong diplomat, these different experiences she brings to the table that are not just gendered, I guess, experiences. I mean, that was part of the issue in 2008 was, oh, she's just been First Lady, as if that's a just, right? But still, that a lot of her kind of national presence had been in that role. Now that she's out of that role and she's held, you know, Secretary of State and has such high approval numbers, she can kind of, again, get to this space that isn't pulled down by our gender stereotypes. Now, she lived through it, we all know, you know, here in Arkansas, but I think it's going to take those kinds of candidates that really, at the first wave, that break out of kind of gender, what's perceived as kind of gendered experiences and get something else to actually be competitive and kind of get into that space. So her example, I think, is even instructive for state politicians.
Well, let's also say one thing in fairness, and it's a great question. Jimmy Lou Fisher came pretty close.
Yes.
And I was going to qualify my statement by saying I wonder if we could recruit Hillary, because I do think Hillary could win.
Steve, in the back. Got to wait for the mic.
You all have any information on whether parents of daughters are less sexist than people who do not have daughters?
I will have that data. In another poll we've run at the University of Arkansas with a different group that looked at dyads, so parent-child relationships and developing attitudes towards race and gender. We don't have it back yet. So we should have some information on that, which would be, you know, really interesting. But again, that's a national sample too, so not particularly instructive in Arkansas. But we need more research on this. We don't do enough about relationship parent-child. We really don't. We leave that to psychologists and we leave it to sociologists because they're not voters. So political scientists tend not to pay attention to them until they're 18. But we need to. So it's a great question because I think it has to be a variable that's in play on some of these issues we're seeing right now. I just think it has to.
Got a question over here.
Yes, I had a question about how you get the data from minorities. I saw it was saying internet polling, but when the percentages of minorities having access to the internet are fairly low, does this account for socioeconomic issues that the poor are less likely to have access to the internet and participate in such a poll? And those that are participating, do you have any kind of ideas to, you know, where they're coming from and that makeup?
Thank you so much for that question. One thing I want to say before I answer that question is we have more data in a report that should be handed out here at the end if you want. You know, we love data in these slides, but Dean Rutherford would told us, you know, don't put up these go on and on like a bunch of academics. So we're trying not to do that, right?
I didn't quite put it that way.
But one of the reasons that we use Knowledge Networks is because they are the only survey research firm that makes sure that they bridge that digital divide. What they do is they take a random sample of the entire country and then they contact you, and if you don't have internet access, which is true for underrepresented groups, the poor, the elderly, the rural, people who live in rural areas, they outfit you with it.
So answer the phone if they call.
So yeah, my colleague says answer the phone if they call. Right? Does that help? Because
well, I just want to chime in real quick. Looking at the African American sample, which is over 800, nationally, 50% are actually earn less than $35,000. So we were able to tap into those persons that normally do not get polled.
Nancy.
I wanted to ask a question about the early slides about sexism or sexist attitudes, and
it looked to me like I could sort of generalize and say it looked like 25% across the board have what we might consider to be sort of extreme sexist attitudes. Can we then therefore assume that as many as 75% of the people do not?
We absolutely can assume that. And again, what we wish we had was that we wish that political scientists had been asking these questions over time so we could see change over time. But again, I think the reason it's so instructive is because of the type of question. Now, would you get, again, people today that would publicly admit on an internet survey or in a phone interview, I don't think women are equal to men? I think we're in a PC enough environment. Yeah, there's going to still be some, but maybe not near this much. What we want to get at is this persistence, this idea that gender equality is some kind of threat to power, or that it's more than equality, or that it's almost getting into the category of kind of accusing it of affirmative action, favoritism, or something like that. And that is there in a high percentage of men, despite the fact that we get people who will say, oh yeah, women and men are equal. In other words, we hear a lot of talk about, you know, equal pay for equal work. Why are we not there, right? This is why we're not there, because these attitudes persist. And yes, it's 25%, and that's very optimistic that 75% don't. On the other hand, it's 2012, and elections are decided by narrow slices. So that 25% in our world is the whole, you know, the whole ball of wax. So I was happy to see it wasn't 50%. It was just optimistic. But it's still, when you look at those questions and you really think somebody to get that kind of score has got to agree or strongly agree on every one of those questions, that's a pretty serious kind of mindset that's not, you know, real supportive of female equality and what it's really trying to do.
Let me just say that we've run out of time because, guys, you have set a new record for the most questions asked at a Clinton School program. Which shows the great interest in your work. They've done a great job. Let's give them a big hand.